Clint Maddox was the kind of man you could pick out of a crowd. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a sun-creased face that spoke of long years under the Montana sky. He'd been a rancher all his life, raising cattle and breaking wild horses, and he carried himself with the quiet, measured confidence of a man who didn't waste words. Folks in town respected him, but they also knew he kept to himself. The saloon chatter always stopped short when someone brought up his late wife, Mary. Mary had been the only woman Clint ever loved. She was quick-witted, warm, and had a laugh that could break a man's worst mood. The two of them built their ranch together, facing droughts, blizzards, and hard times with grit and loyalty. But one autumn afternoon, tragedy struck. Mary was thrown from her horse when it spooked at a rattlesnake. Clint had been there, rushing to her side, holding her in his arms as the life faded from her eyes. Her final words were spoken in a weak but steady voice, a phrase so personal, so intimate, that Clint never shared it with another soul. No matter how far the trail goes, I'll ride it with you, a broken bar always. Then she was gone. For years after, Clint kept to the ranch. Work was his shield against grief. He rose before dawn, fed the cattle, mended fences, and kept his mind fixed on the land rather than the hole in his heart. Women in town tried to catch his eye, but he had no interest. Love had been buried with Mary, and Clint intended to keep it that way. One cold winter night, after hauling feed through a snowstorm, Clint came into town for supplies. The wind howled outside the saloon, and inside, the air was warm with the scent of whiskey and wood smoke. He sat at the bar, nursing a drink, when his eyes fell on an old, yellowed newspaper someone had left behind. Most of it was advertisements and trade notices, but a bold heading caught his attention. Mail order brides, a strong, loyal, and ready for a frontier life. He scoffed. The idea was absurd. A man didn't just order a wife like he ordered a saddle. But curiosity got the better of him. He read on the ad promised women from all over the country, some even from overseas, willing to work, ride, and help build a future in the untamed West. It was foolish, he told himself, and he shoved the paper aside. But when he returned to the ranch that night, the words kept circling in his head. Maybe it was the whiskey, maybe it was the long loneliness, but by the next evening he found himself writing a letter to the address listed. Weeks passed with no reply, and Clint pushed the matter from his mind. Then one late spring morning, as he was fixing a broken gate near the road, he heard the distant rattle of a stagecoach. Dust billowed in the distance, and soon a tall, black coach rolled to a stop in front of his ranch. The driver hopped down and opened the door. Out stepped a woman unlike any Clint had ever seen. She was enormous, not in a clumsy way, but with a presence that demanded attention. At least 6'7", broad-shouldered, with muscular arms that looked like they could lift a hay bale in one hand. Her skin was bronzed from the sun, and her long, dark hair was tied back in a braid that swung against her back. She wore worn leather boots, a faded duster coat, and a hat tilted low over eyes as gray as a storm cloud. She took 2 long strides toward him and stuck out her hand. "Name's Annabelle," she said, her voice deep and steady. "You're Clint Maddox, I reckon?" Clint stared for a moment before shaking her hand. "That's me." "You're Broken Bar, the one from the agency?" "That's right," she said. "And don't you worry, I pull my weight. Can work cattle, mend fence, cook if I have to, though I ain't no delicate flower in the kitchen. And I can handle a 6-shooter better than most men I've met." Her confidence was almost unsettling. Clint had expected a Broken Bar well, he wasn't sure what he had expected. Certainly not this towering, fearless woman who seemed to size up everything around her as if deciding whether it was worth her time. Life with Annabelle started with a bang, literally. On her second day at the ranch, one of Clint's young bulls broke through the fence. Clint was saddling up to chase it down when he heard a commotion in the corral. Annabelle had roped the bull, dug her heels into the dirt, and was hauling it back like it was nothing more than a stubborn mule. Clint watched, slack-jawed, as she tied it off with practiced skill. "You are taking too long," she said with a smirk, brushing dust from her hands. From that day on, the ranch was louder, rowdier, and somehow more alive. Annabelle wasn't afraid to speak her mind. She challenged Clint to drink contests at the saloon, played poker with the ranch hands, and once knocked a man to the floor for spitting too close to her boots. She worked hard, though, rising before dawn and putting in long hours without complaint. Still, Clint kept his emotional distance. This was a practical arrangement, not a love story. At night, they sat at opposite ends of the porch, each sipping coffee in the cool Montana air. Sometimes she told stories about growing up in Texas, where she'd wrangled cattle alongside her brothers. Other times, she fell into a thoughtful silence, staring out at the endless sweep of prairie as if remembering something far away. Despite his best efforts, Clint found himself watching her when she didn't notice, the way her eyes lit up when she laughed, the way she leaned against the fence post at sunset, her hat tilted back, hair catching the light. She wasn't like Mary Ann Owen could be, but there was a strength in her that felt oddly familiar, like an echo from the past. The townsfolk had their opinions, of course. Some found Annabelle intimidating, others admired her. More than a few made jokes about Clint buying a wife. He ignored them. What mattered was that the ranch was running smoother, and, though he wouldn't admit it, the loneliness that had sat in his chest for years had started to ease. One evening, after a long day mending fences, Clint sat on the porch with Annabelle. The sun was sinking low, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. She leaned back in her chair, took a slow sip of coffee, and smiled faintly. "You ever think about what's past?" she asked. Clint shifted uncomfortably. "Not much good comes from digging up old ghosts." She studied him for a long moment, her storm-gray eyes unreadable. Then she turned her gaze back to the horizon, as if letting the question drift away with the evening breeze. Clint didn't know it then, but that question would be the crack that opened everything at the past he'd tried to bury, the secret words he thought belonged to Mary alone, and the truth about the woman sitting across from him. And that truth was coming sooner than he could imagine. The days grew longer as spring bled into summer, and the ranch hummed with activity. Calving season had come and gone, the fences stood firm, and the cattle grazed fat and content under the Montana sun. Clint had to admit, Annabelle had changed the rhythm of the place. It wasn't just her hard work, it was her presence. She carried herself like someone who belonged anywhere she set her boots, and yet there was something guarded in her, something that hinted at unspoken truths. Clint still held her at arm's length emotionally, but the walls he had built around his heart were starting to thin. He caught himself enjoying her company, listening a little too closely to her stories, noticing the way her deep laugh rolled out like distant thunder. It scared him, in a way, to feel anything that resembled what he'd felt for Mary. Love had been a one-time thing in his mind, and you didn't get a second shot. One warm evening, after a long day branding cattle, Clint and Annabelle sat on the porch again. The sky was streaked with the colors of sunset, and the air was heavy with the scent of sagebrush. They didn't speak for a while, letting the soft creak of their chairs fill the silence. Then Annabelle leaned forward, elbows on her knees, and fixed her gaze on him. "You ever think about what Mary would want for you?" she asked, her voice steady but low. Clint froze. He didn't like to talk about Mary. Folks in town knew better than to bring her up. But something in Annabelle's tone made it hard to brush the question aside. "She's gone," he said after a moment. "Ain't much point in thinking about what she'd want now." Annabelle didn't press, just nodded slowly. "Sometimes," The dead still have plans for the living." Her words sat heavy in the air between them. Clint didn't know what to make of it, so he said nothing, retreating into the safe quiet he had kept for years. The next week, they rode into town together to sell a few head of cattle. At the saloon, Clint went to settle the accounts while Annabelle took a seat at a corner table. She drew attention the moment she walked in, not just because of her size, but because she carried herself with a kind of fearless self-assurance that made men step out of her way. A group of ranch hands at the next table started making crude remarks, not loud enough for the barkeep to hear, but just enough for Clint to catch. Before he could step in, Annabelle was already on her feet. She crossed the room in 3 strides and stood over the man who had spoken. "Say it again," she told him, her voice calm but cold. The man laughed nervously, muttered something about a joke, and she leaned down until her shadow swallowed him whole. "I said, say it again." He didn't. And when she turned and walked back to the table, the saloon was quiet enough to hear the clock ticking behind the bar. On the ride home, Clint glanced at her and shook his head. "You can't go throwing your weight around like that." She smirked. "Why not? Worked, didn't it?" Despite himself, Clint laughed. She had that effect on him, breaking through the gruff exterior he'd worn for years. Summer wore on, and the bond between them deepened in small, almost invisible ways. They moved together in the daily work as if they'd been partners for years. She patched his shirt without asking. He set aside the last piece of pie for her without thinking. Neither of them called it love, but something was taking root. Then came the night that changed everything. It was early September, the air turning crisp, the stars burning bright over the prairie. They sat on the porch, coffee mugs in hand, the sounds of the night around them. Annabelle's voice was softer than usual when she finally spoke. "No matter how far the trail goes," she said, her eyes fixed on the horizon, "I'll ride it with you, a broken bar always." Clint felt the air leave his lungs. The words hit him like a bolt of lightning. His coffee cup slipped from his hand and landed on the porch with a dull thud, spilling cold liquid across the boards. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice rough. She turned to look at him, brow furrowing. "I said I'll ride the trail with you, always." "No," he said sharply. "Those exact words, a broken bar, where did you hear them?" Annabelle's gaze didn't waver. She took a long breath before answering. "From Mary." Clint's hands clenched into fists. "How the hell do you know what Mary said to me?" "Those were her last words, nobody else heard them." Annabelle set her mug down, her expression uncharacteristically gentle. "Because Mary was my cousin. We grew up together down in Texas. I was with her a few months before she came here with you. She told me about you, how stubborn you were, how you'd work yourself to death if you didn't have someone equally stubborn to keep you in check. She made me promise that if anything ever happened to her, I'd find you." Clint stared at her, his mind reeling. "You're telling me this whole thing, you coming here, marrying me, it wasn't random?" "No," she said. "I signed up with the mail order agency because it was the only way I could get here without raising questions. I figured if I just showed up, you'd send me packing. But if I came through the agency, you might give me a chance to prove myself." He sat back, the porch creaking under his weight, his chest tight. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because you weren't ready," she said simply. "You still looked at me like I was just some stranger on your land. I had to wait until you saw me for more than that." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind stirred the dry grass, and somewhere out on the range, a coyote called. Clint thought about Mary, about the way she'd always known how to see straight through him. It was just like her to plan something like this, to make sure he wasn't left alone to bury himself in work and grief. Finally, Clint let out a long breath. She was right. You're just as stubborn as me. Annabelle smiled faintly. Guess that's why we make a good team. From that night forward, something shifted between them. Clint no longer saw Annabelle as a hired partner or a convenient arrangement. She was his equal, his ally, and, though he wouldn't say it out loud just yet, the second great love of his life. The townsfolk noticed the change, too. The jokes about the giant bride stopped when they saw the way Clint looked at her with the same quiet pride he'd once reserved for Mary. They worked side by side through the fall, preparing the ranch for winter. And when the first snow fell, Clint caught himself thinking that maybe, just maybe, Mary was still riding with him after all. Only now, her spirit had found a way to share the saddle with someone new. The past hadn't vanished, but it no longer weighed him down. The trail ahead was long, and for the first time in years, Clint wasn't afraid of where it might lead. Because now, he knew he wouldn't be riding it alone.